Here is a sentence that should not be possible in the 12th century. A woman was crowned king. Not queen consort, not queen regent, not a placeholder keeping a throne warm for a son who would grow up and take it from her. King, that was the actual word carved into her documents, sung by her poets, spoken by bishops who bowed before her. In a world where a woman's ambition was treated as a defect to be corrected through marriage, one woman in the mountains between the Black Sea and the Caspian looked at every assumption her civilization had about power and simply refused to accept it. Her name was Tamar, and by the time she died, chroniclers were writing that Georgia had never been larger, richer, or more feared, and that all of it happened under a monarch the histories still could not decide how to gender. Was she extraordinary because she was a woman who ruled like a king, or because she made the entire distinction meaningless? I've spent weeks with this question, reading through chronicles written by men who clearly did not know what to do with her, who kept reaching for the language of kingship because nothing else in their vocabulary was large enough to hold what she'd actually built, and I still don't think there's a clean answer. Maybe that's the point. Stick around, because the answer is stranger and more brutal than you'd expect, and it starts with a crime committed against someone else entirely, years before Tamar herself ever sat on a throne. Before we get into it, if you're new here, comment down below where in the world you're watching this from, and while you're there, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. This is the kind of history I dig into every week. The stories that get buried under the bigger, more famous names. Here's a fact that might unsettle you. Tamar's path to the throne was paved with someone else's mutilation. Her father ordered his own nephew blinded and castrated to eliminate him as a rival, and then, almost in the same breath, declared his infant daughter heir to the kingdom. Cruelty and radical inclusion arriving in the same royal decree. That contradiction is not an accident of this story. It is the story. To understand how strange that decree really was, you first have to understand where Georgia actually sat on the map of the medieval world, because this was not some isolated backwater where unusual things could happen without consequence. Georgia occupied one of the most contested pieces of real estate on the planet, a mountainous corridor wedged between the Black Sea and the Caspian, between the Christian Byzantine Empire to the west and the Muslim Seljuk world pressing in from the south and east. Armies had crossed this land for centuries. Empires had bled for it. A generation before Tamar was even born, her great-grandfather, a king remembered as David, the builder, had spent his reign clawing Georgia back from the edge of irrelevance, driving out Seljuk garrisons, reforming the army, and turning a fractured, tribute-paying kingdom into a power capable of dictating terms to its neighbors, instead of begging for mercy from them. David's reforms are the reason Tamar had a throne worth fighting over in the first place. He had built the foundation. Her father had defended it, viciously, at times monstrously, and now it would fall to a teenage girl to decide whether that foundation could hold weight it had genuinely never been designed to carry. In a neighborhood where every single surrounding power, the Seljuks, the Byzantines, a dozen smaller emirates and principalities, watched Georgian succession crises the way wolves watch an injured animal. Waiting for the exact moment weakness became exploitable. Georgia's own nobility, meanwhile, were not exactly a unified bloc eager to rally behind whichever monarch the crown happened to produce. They were dukes and princes of fiercely independent temperament, men who governed their own valleys and fortresses with something close to sovereignty of their own, who had spent generations testing every new monarch's resolve within months of a coronation. and who would extend loyalty only for as long as the throne proved it could still command genuine fear alongside genuine respect. This was the inheritance waiting for Tamar the moment her father decided biology would not be allowed to determine who sat above them all. Picture Georgia in the year 1178, a council chamber in Tbilisi, thick with incense and the smell of wax candles burning low, packed with the most powerful nobles in the Caucasus, men who commanded private armies larger than some king's entire forces, dressed in the layered silks and embroidered fabrics that Georgian nobility had absorbed from centuries of contact with Byzantium to the west and Persia to the south. A court sitting at the exact crossroads where those two great cultural worlds bled into each other. Outside, Tbilisi itself sprawled along the banks of the Kura River, a city of stone churches and bathhouses fed by natural hot springs, already centuries old by this point, already a place where Armenian merchants, Persian traders, and Byzantine clergy moved through the same crowded streets. At the front of the council chamber stands George III, a monarch who has spent his reign putting down rebellions with a brutality that earned him fear rather than love. Beside him is his daughter. Her exact age here is one of those small details historians still argue about, since her birth is dated anywhere from around 1160 to 1166, which would put her somewhere between 12 and 18 at this coronation, and I'll be honest with you, rather than paper over it, because that 6-year gap is the difference between a father grooming a near-adult successor and one making a much bolder bet on a child. Whichever it was, she is composed in a way that unsettles the older men watching her, because composure in someone that young was supposed to look like submission, and hers does not. And then he crowns her. Co-ruler, sharing his throne while he still breathes, still commands, still terrifies. Tradition holds that George justified the decision with a declaration about lions, insisting that a cub's nature does not change based on whether it is male or female. Though it's worth being upfront that the version of this line historians can actually document with confidence comes not from George's own mouth, but from a poem written a generation later, which we'll get to. Whether George said something like it first, or whether later Georgians simply folded a beloved line of poetry backward into his legend. The sentiment behind it is exactly what he was communicating to the room. Biology was not going to determine who inherited Georgia. It is one of the boldest political gambles of the medieval world, and almost nobody in that room believes it will actually stick. To understand why George III made this gamble, you have to go back further, to the crisis that came before it, because Tamar's crown was built on top of someone else's ruin. George had a nephew named Demna, and Demna had a claim to the throne that rivaled George's own, since Demna's father had briefly ruled Georgia before George pushed him aside and forced him into a monastery, the medieval version of a permanent political retirement. That should have settled things. It didn't. A faction of nobles, always looking for leverage, always looking to weaken whichever monarch currently sat above them, rallied around Demna as an alternative king, a living threat that could be activated whenever the aristocracy wanted more autonomy from the crown. This is worth understanding clearly, because it will matter again and again throughout Tamar's own reign. Georgian kingship in this era was never simply handed down from father to son in some clean, uncontested line. It was fought for, continuously, by a landed aristocracy that treated royal succession as an opportunity rather than a formality. And any king who failed to demonstrate overwhelming force at the first sign of a rival claim was inviting a civil war he might not survive. George crushed the rebellion. And when I say crushed, I mean he ordered his own nephew blinded and castrated. the standard Byzantine-influenced method for permanently disqualifying a rival claimant from ever taking a throne, since Georgian and Byzantine political theory both held that a mutilated body could not legitimately wear a crown. A physically maimed man, in the logic of the era, was considered incomplete and therefore ineligible to embody the sacred wholeness a monarch was supposed to represent before God. It is a chilling piece of political theology when you sit with it. Violence against the body as a form of constitutional law, a punishment engineered not merely to cause suffering, but to permanently rewrite a man's legal existence. Demna did not survive the procedure. He died from his wounds, whether from the trauma itself or from the infection that so often followed such punishments in an age without anything resembling modern medicine. George had eliminated his last realistic male rival within the family, and it left him staring at a genuinely unprecedented problem. He had no son. He had one daughter, and centuries of precedent said that a daughter simply did not rule Georgia in her own right. She married. She produced an heir. She was, at best, a vessel for continuity, never the destination. George's own preferred solution, by eliminating Demna so completely, had backed him into a corner where the only path forward ran directly through the one child he actually had. George III chose to break that precedent, and I don't think he did it out of some progressive instinct that transcended his century. This was a man who tortured his own family members into submission. Remember, I think he did it because he understood something colder and more practical. The alternative to Tamar was chaos, a succession fight among nobles who would tear the kingdom apart, competing for a throne with no clear heir. A daughter with an undisputed bloodline was a stronger claim than any compromise candidate the aristocracy might cobble together. So in 1178, likely somewhere in her teens, he had her crowned co-ruler, sharing power and presence at court, deliberately giving her years to learn the mechanics of governance while he was still alive to shield her from the worst of the political knives aimed her way. For 6 years, father and daughter ruled side by side. Tamar sat in on council sessions. She watched how George negotiated with fractious nobles, how he balanced the church's enormous political weight against the aristocracy's private armies, how he projected authority in a room that did not want to grant it to him, let alone to her. It was, in effect, the longest and most deliberate apprenticeship any Georgian monarch had ever received, and George needed every year of it, because he could see what was coming. The moment he died, every assumption the nobility held about a woman's fitness to rule alone was going to come roaring back to the surface. There is a detail buried in the Georgian language itself that tells you exactly how radical this arrangement actually was. And it's a detail I find genuinely fascinating every time I come back to this period. Georgian did not, at that point in its history, have a distinct word for a female sovereign. The title for monarch was mepe, and mepe simply did not carry gender the way king and queen carry gender in English or French or German. There was a separate word, dedopali, used for queen's consort, for the wives and senior female relatives of kings, an entirely different social category from mepe, one that implied proximity to power rather than possession of it. When Tamar was crowned, the chroniclers, the bishops, her own court poets, all of them called her Mep. King, not because Georgian grammar forced their hand, but because there was no honest alternative that captured what George III had actually done. He hadn't created a queen. There was no precedent in Georgian history for what a reigning queen even was. He had inserted his daughter directly into the only available category of supreme rule that existed in the language. And that category happened to be grammatically and conceptually male. Some later chroniclers would go even further, styling her not merely Mep, but Mepeta Mep, King of Kings. The exact same superlative title Georgian tradition had historically reserved for the most dominant monarchs of the age. Coins struck during her reign and official charters piled title upon title in the ornate style medieval chanceries favoured: Master of the Lands, Father of Orphans, Champion of the Messiah, by the will of God King, and Queen of the Abkhaz, Kartvelians, Rans, Kaks, and Armenians. It reads almost like an act of linguistic overcompensation when you say it out loud, an attempt to pile up enough grand, unambiguous language that nobody reading the document could mistake her authority for anything partial or provisional. Whether that was Tamar's own insistence on eliminating any ambiguity about the nature of her rule, or simply the natural extension of a language with no better word available, the effect was the same. There would be no linguistic hiding place for anyone who wanted to treat her authority as somehow smaller, softer, or more provisional than a man's. George III died in 1184, and almost immediately, the fragile consensus that had let Tamar sit on the throne beside her father began to crack. Two figures proved essential in keeping that crack from becoming a complete collapse in the earliest, most dangerous days of the transition. Tamar's aunt Rusudan, an experienced political operator in her own right, whose counsel Tamar would keep leaning on for years afterward. And the Catholicos Patriarch Michael, whose ecclesiastical authority carried weight that even the most defiant noblemen hesitated to openly challenge. Without their combined intervention in those first uncertain weeks, it is entirely possible the succession crisis brewing beneath the surface would have exploded into open civil war before Tamar ever had the chance to prove what kind of monarch she intended to be. Here's the uncomfortable truth about medieval succession. A co-ruler is not automatically a sole ruler. The moment George's breath left his body, Tamar's legitimacy became, once again, an open question. Precisely the question George had spent 6 years trying to close. The nobility, sensing an opportunity, moved fast. Some demanded she be recrowned entirely, as if the first coronation had not fully counted, a symbolic but pointed reminder that her authority flowed through their permission, not through inheritance alone. She agreed to it. It cost her nothing to submit to a ceremony, and she needed the aristocracy calm before she could consolidate anything real. Other demands cut much deeper. A faction wanted her to strip power from officials her father had elevated, men who owed their positions to George rather than to the old bloodlines, and remove them from the machinery of government. Among the targets was Kubasar, a Kipchak-born commander who held the position of Amir Spasalari, essentially commander-in-chief of the Georgian military, a foreigner, in the eyes of the native aristocracy, occupying a position they believed belonged to Georgian blood. Tamar agreed to this too. It must have stung. Kubasar had been loyal, but a young queen, still new to sole power, facing down a room of armed noblemen, learns quickly which battles to lose in order to survive long enough to win the ones that matter. There was also the matter of the Catholicos Patriarch Michael, the highest-ranking bishop in the kingdom, who held not only spiritual authority but also, thanks to a policy established under David the Builder, the secular office of chancellor, meaning one man sat at the very top of both the religious and administrative hierarchies simultaneously, an almost unimaginable concentration of institutional power. Tamar, uneasy about a single figure wielding that much leverage over her fledgling reign, tried in 1185 to convene a church synod aimed at unseating him. It failed. The assembled bishops declined to move against their own patriarch, though they did agree to strip a handful of Michael's most hostile allies from positions of power, a partial victory that left Tamar with a valuable lesson about the limits of her authority over Georgia's ecclesiastical establishment, even as sole monarch. And then the nobility overreached, the way overconfident men so often do when they mistake concession for weakness. A faction led by a noble named Kutlu Arslan proposed something radical, a permanent council, sometimes referred to in the chronicles as the Karavi, through which the aristocracy would appoint government ministers and enact laws largely independent of the crown's authority. This was not a request for influence. It was a demand to functionally neuter the monarchy, to convert Tamar into a figurehead presiding over decisions made elsewhere by men who had never faced the burden of ruling and never would. What makes the episode so striking is who Kutlu Arslan actually was. Not a great feudal lord from an ancient bloodline, but reportedly a man of comparatively modest origin, a potter by trade in some accounts, elevated by circumstance into a position of enough influence to challenge a monarch directly. His faction wanted the queen, and I'm quoting the substance of the demand here rather than any single source, physically excluded from the workings of this new council altogether. Not consulted. Not present. Excluded. Here is where the young monarch the nobles had been managing suddenly stopped being manageable. Tamar had Kutlu Arslan arrested. Not exiled. Not quietly sidelined. Arrested. Publicly. Unmistakably. The message could not have been clearer if she'd shouted it from the palace walls. I will bend on personnel. I will bend on ceremony. But I will not bend on sovereignty itself. When the rest of the rebellious faction realized their leader was in chains and that the queen they'd assumed would fold was instead willing to escalate, they backed down. Tamar, ever the calculating strategist even this early in her reign, offered them a pardon. She did not need a bloodbath. She needed obedience, and she had just proven, in the clearest possible terms, exactly how far she was willing to go to get it. It is a pattern you should file away now, because it will repeat, in different forms, again and again across the rest of her reign. An initial willingness to compromise, a hard, immovable line the moment sovereignty itself is threatened, and a merciful hand extended to anyone smart enough to back down once that line has been drawn. With her authority stabilized, at least for the moment, the nobility turned to the next weapon in their arsenal: marriage. A ruling queen without a husband was, in the political logic of the 12th century, a vulnerability, an unclaimed piece on the board. Worse, from the aristocracy's perspective, an unmarried female sovereign meant no clear mechanism for producing an heir, and no man at the head of the army when Georgia inevitably went to war, since it was simply assumed, correctly, as it turned out, though not for the reasons anyone expected, that Tamar herself would not personally lead troops into battle. Two rival factions at court fought to select her husband, each one angling to plant their own candidate beside the throne and, through him, gain influence no direct appointment could offer. The faction that won out was backed by Tamar's aunt Rusudan, a formidable political operator in her own right, and by the Catholicos Patriarch Michael, the head of the Georgian Church, whose support had been essential to Tamar's succession, and who now expected a say in shaping what came next. Their chosen candidate was a Rus prince named Yuri, sometimes called Yuri Bogolubsky, son of a murdered prince from Vladimir Suzdal, a man who had spent recent years as something close to a fugitive among the Kipchak tribes of the North Caucasus, after his own father's assassination scattered his family's fortunes. Yuri had a reputation as a warrior, which mattered enormously to a court anxious about military leadership, and he had royal blood, which mattered just as much to a court obsessed with legitimacy. Fetching him was itself an operation, entrusted to a wealthy Georgian merchant named Zankan Zorobabeli, who tracked the exiled prince down among the tribes north of the mountains and brought him south into a kingdom. And a marriage he could barely have imagined existed for him a few years earlier. In 1185, he was brought to Tbilisi, and Tamar, not entirely by her own free choice, but under the accumulated pressure of nearly every powerful figure around her, married him. Try to sit inside that moment for a second, because it rarely gets the attention it deserves. Tamar was likely still in her late teens or barely into her 20s. She had just spent a year fighting off a coalition of nobles trying to strip her authority down to nothing, had already been forced to sacrifice a loyal commander and watch her own attempt to check the church's power fail outright. And now, as a kind of final concession to keep every remaining faction at court satisfied, she was handed a husband she had never met. A man whose entire biography up to that point consisted of exile, violence, and a dead father. Whatever affection or hope she might have carried into that marriage, if any, the sources give us no window into it. What they give us, instead, is the aftermath. It went wrong almost immediately, and it went wrong in ways that are still debated by historians because the surviving Georgian chronicle, written under Tamar's own patronage, had every incentive to make her ex-husband look as monstrous as possible to justify what she did next. What we do know is this: Yuri drank heavily, by every contemporary account. The chronicles also accuse him of what medieval sources delicately term deviant behavior, essentially framing him as a man whose private conduct made him unfit to sit beside a queen the church had helped legitimize through sheer moral authority. Whether every specific accusation was true or politically convenient hardly matters for understanding what happened next, because what mattered to Tamar was outcome, not motive. In 1187, roughly 2 years into the marriage, she went to the noble council, the same body of men who had insisted she marry Yuri in the first place, and persuaded them to approve a divorce. Think about how remarkable that sentence actually is for the period. A queen, unhappy in a politically arranged marriage that half the aristocracy had personally engineered, did not simply endure it the way essentially every royal woman in Europe at that moment would have been expected to. She built a coalition. She made her case. And she won. Yuri was sent into exile in Constantinople, stripped of his position as consort. His brief and disastrous chapter in Georgian history closed. Except Yuri did not accept that the chapter was closed. This is the part of the story that reveals something crucial about Tamar as a ruler, not just as a woman navigating a hostile court, but as someone with a genuinely formidable political mind. A divorced, exiled prince with a taste for power does not simply fade away. And Yuri didn't. He resurfaced in Turkish territory, in Erzurum, where a faction of Georgian nobles still loyal to his cause. Men who resented Tamar's growing independence and saw in Yuri a vehicle for clawing back influence, welcomed him and crowned him king in a rival ceremony at the royal palace of Guguti. A direct, unmistakable challenge to Tamar's sole legitimacy. She did not panic. She sent negotiators first, offering the rebels a chance to stand down without bloodshed, and when that failed, she sent her loyalist army into the field and crushed them. What happened next tells you almost everything you need to know about how Tamar intended to rule. Yuri himself was sent back into exile rather than executed. The rebels who had crowned him lost their lands and their titles. A devastating economic and social punishment in a feudal system built entirely around land. but they kept their heads. This mercy was not softness. It was strategy, and it became something close to a signature of her reign. Crush the rebellion decisively enough that no one doubts your capacity for force. Then extend clemency generous enough that former enemies have a path back into the fold rather than a reason to keep fighting until death. When one of the rebellious lords, a man named Guzan of Dao, rebelled a second time after already receiving mercy once, Tamar's second husband had him blinded before she could intervene with another pardon, a sign that even her own allies sometimes felt her clemency ran further than pure pragmatism justified. But Uri himself made one more attempt at reclaiming the throne after his first defeat, drawing on whatever remaining sympathy existed among the nobles who had originally chosen him for her, and it failed just as completely as the one before it. After that, he disappears from the historical record almost entirely, a footnote to a reign that was only beginning to hit its stride. A man whose entire historical significance ended up resting on how decisively a still young queen managed to outmaneuver him, twice. I'll be honest, this is the part of Tamar's story I find myself coming back to the most. Maybe because it's the most human. Before she was a lawgiver or a conqueror, she was a young monarch stuck in a marriage nobody had let her choose, who found a way out of it not through submission or scandal, but through sheer political skill, building consensus among the exact council that had trapped her there in the first place. If you're watching this, and you've ever felt boxed in by a decision other people made for you, there's something worth sitting with in how she handled it. Comment down below and let me know where you're tuning in from tonight. I always love reading through those while I'm researching the next one of these. Because by the time Uri's second uprising collapsed, Tamar had already remarried, and this time, the choice was entirely her own. His name was David Soslan, a prince from Alania, the mountainous region north of Georgia populated by the ancestors of today's Ossetians, and one 18th century Georgian scholar, writing more than 500 years after the fact, traced his line back to an earlier Georgian king through a branch of the royal family that had settled among the Alans generations before. A genealogy that can't really be checked against anything contemporary to David's own lifetime, so it's probably best treated as court tradition rather than settled fact. Unlike Uri, David was not imposed on Tamar by a council desperate to check her power or a church anxious about her marital status. She selected him. And unlike her first marriage, this one worked, both as a political partnership and, as far as the sources allow us to tell across 9 centuries of distance, as something closer to genuine partnership between equals. David was a capable military commander, and it was David who would go on to personally lead Georgian armies in the field, freeing Tamar from ever having to resolve the awkward contradiction of a monarch who was also expected, by the gender norms of her era, to remain physically apart from the front lines of combat. Officially, David held the status of a king consort. His image appeared on coins and charters, the trappings of male kingship layered over a marriage where everyone at court understood, and the chronicles make no attempt to hide that ultimate authority remained with Tamar. He derived his power from her, not the reverse, a reversal of essentially every royal marriage pattern in medieval Christendom. And it seems to have caused remarkably little friction, at least none that survives in the record. There is something quietly remarkable in that lack of friction, if you stop to think about what it required of David personally. He was, by every account, an accomplished warrior in his own right. Exactly the kind of man who in almost any other kingdom in Europe or the Near East at that moment would have expected his marriage to a reigning queen to gradually convert into outright kingship. the way so many royal consorts before and after him maneuvered to do. David never seems to have made that attempt. He fought Tamar's wars, secured her rebellious frontiers, fathered her heirs, and by every surviving indication accepted, without recorded resentment, that the throne beneath him belonged to his wife and would remain hers until she chose otherwise. Georgian tradition remembers the marriage as something closer to a genuine partnership forged in mutual respect than a political arrangement merely tolerated by two ambitious people. And whatever the emotional truth buried underneath 9 centuries of chronicle and legend, the practical result was a level of internal stability Tamar's first marriage had never come close to providing. Their partnership produced the heirs that 6 years of co-rule with her father and a failed first marriage had failed to secure. Around 1192, Tamar gave birth to a son, George, who would eventually rule as George IV and carries the nickname Lasha in some sources, meaning something like enlightener in the Old Georgian used at court. A few years later, around 1195, came a daughter, Rusudan, who would herself eventually inherit the throne and rule Georgia in her own right, becoming the second, and, as it would turn out, the last, woman to hold supreme power in medieval Georgian history, following directly in the precedent her mother had shattered open. The dynasty was secure. The succession, the single most volatile flashpoint in any medieval monarchy, the crisis that had nearly derailed Tamar's own reign before it began, was now settled with not one heir, but 2. A son and a daughter, both raised inside a court where their mother's authority was simply the ordinary fact of their childhood, rather than a scandalous exception. Think about what that means for how those 2 children understood the world. George Lasha grew up watching his mother command armies, negotiate with bishops, arrest rebellious nobles, and rule a kingdom stretching from sea to sea, with his father visibly, publicly subordinate to her in matters of state, even while commanding her armies in the field. Rusudan grew up in that same household, absorbing an entirely different lesson than most royal daughters of her era ever received, that the throne itself was not conceptually closed to her, because she had watched her own mother sit on it, unchallenged, for years. It is not hard to draw a direct line between the household Tamar built and the fact that when George Lasha eventually died young, Georgia turned once again to a daughter rather than treating a female successor as unthinkable. Tamar had not just claimed the throne, she had normalized the idea that a woman could hold it, inside the one household with enough influence to make that normalization matter. With her throne stabilized, her marriage secure, and her succession settled, Tamar turned her attention to the machinery of the kingdom itself. And this is where her reign starts to look less like a story of survival and more like a genuine program of transformation. She reformed the legal system in ways that were startling by the standards of her century, and honestly startling by the standards of several centuries afterward too. Her father's reign had leaned on torture, mutilation, and capital punishment as ordinary instruments of state control. Remember, this was the same George III who had his own nephew blinded and castrated to eliminate a rival. Tamar walked large parts of that machinery back. Chronicles describe her banning torture as an instrument of interrogation and punishment, moving away from the death penalty and refusing to employ the exact catalogue of mutilating punishments, whipping, blinding, castration, that had defined justice under her father's rule, and, frankly, under most of the surrounding kingdoms of the period. I want to sit with that for a second, because it is easy to let a detail like this slide past in a list of accomplishments. This is a monarch who came to power in the direct aftermath of a mutilation carried out by her own father to clear her path to the throne, and one of her first substantial acts as sole ruler was to functionally outlaw the very category of punishment that had made her reign possible in the first place. Whether that was conviction, calculation, or some blend of both that not even Tamar herself could have fully separated, the effect on ordinary Georgians was real, and the chroniclers of the period specifically credit her reign with a kind of relative gentleness that stood out against the surrounding political landscape. Later Georgian ecclesiastical writers would go so far as to describe her as a mother to orphans and a shelter for the poor, language that sounds like standard royal flattery, until you remember how specifically it contrasts with the reign that came immediately before hers, one defined by broken kneecaps as a preferred method of chastising rebellious subjects and a mutilated nephew who never survived his punishment. A monarch who had every incentive, given how she came to power, to rule through fear alone instead, built a reputation, deserved or embellished, for choosing restraint precisely where restraint was hardest to justify. Her governing style extended well beyond the courtroom and the throne hall. Tamar inherited a kingdom stitched together from formerly independent principalities, each with its own local nobility, its own customs, its own simmering resentments about answering to Tbilisi at all. And part of what made her reign genuinely transformative rather than simply successful was her ability to bind those fractured territories into something that started to feel, for the first time, like a coherent Georgian identity rather than a loose federation of conquered neighbors. She balanced the competing power centers of church and aristocracy with a patience that must have taken enormous discipline for a monarch who had already proven, more than once, exactly how forcefully she could act when patience ran out. Provincial governors reported through a chain of command her great-grandfather had first established. But Tamar refined and personalized it, rewarding loyalty with land and position while making unmistakably clear, through the fate of men like Kutlu Arslan, exactly what defiance cost. Envoys from her court traveled as far as Jerusalem, and unlike most Christian pilgrims of the era, Georgian representatives were reportedly granted free passage into the holy city itself, a small but telling detail about how far Tamar's diplomatic reach and reputation had already begun to extend beyond the borders she ruled directly, into a Mediterranean world watching the rise of this Caucasian kingdom with growing curiosity. That gentleness, though, existed alongside a treasury that was filling up faster than almost any Georgian ruler before her had managed. Because trade routes across the Caucasus were thriving under the stability her consolidated authority provided, and tribute was flowing in from expanding Georgian influence over neighboring territories. Caravans moving between the Black Sea ports and the trading cities of Persia and Central Asia increasingly ran through Georgian-controlled territory, and every caravan that passed safely under Georgian protection meant tolls, customs revenue, and goods flowing into a royal treasury that Tamar's predecessors could only have dreamed of commanding. Silk, spices, and precious metals moved along these routes in growing volume, and Georgian merchants themselves began appearing more frequently in the commercial records of neighboring states, evidence of a kingdom whose economic reach was expanding just as quickly as its military and territorial reach. And where money accumulates at a royal court with genuine intellectual appetite behind it, culture tends to follow. This is the period modern historians and, honestly, Tamar's own contemporaries started calling Georgia's Golden Age, and nowhere is that more vivid than in the person of a court official named Shota Rustaveli. Rustaveli served in Tamar's administration, reportedly as a minister overseeing the treasury, and somewhere in the midst of managing the Queen's finances, he found time to write what would become the single most important work of literature Georgia has ever produced. An epic poem called Vepkist Kausani, usually translated as The Knight in the Panther's Skin, On its surface, the poem is set in fictional versions of India and Arabia, following two knights bound by loyalty on a quest tangled up with love, honor, and rescue. But strip away the exotic setting, and what you're actually reading is an extended allegory for Tamar's own court, her own glory, dressed up in the language of chivalric romance. Because direct, literal praise of a living monarch would have felt crude next to what Rustaveli was actually trying to build. A permanent literary monument to an era he clearly understood, even while living through it, as something exceptional. The poem contains the line I mentioned earlier, the one about lions. This is actually where it comes from. Stanza 39, and it's the only version of it modern scholars can point to with real confidence, that a lion's cub carries the same dignity, whether it is female or male. Everything you hear about George III supposedly speaking those exact words at Tamar's coronation traces back, as far as anyone can verify, to this poem, written years into her reign, as a tribute rather than to a transcript of anything actually said in 1178. Georgian scholars studying the philosophy taught at the Gelati Academy have suggested Rustaveli was drawing on translated Platonic ideas about women's fitness to rule, dressing an argument in verse that would have sounded far too radical stated as plain political theory. Somewhere between Rustaveli's original line and 9 centuries of retelling, popular memory folded it backward into her father's mouth, which tells you something almost as interesting as the line itself. This is a sentiment Georgians wanted to believe had been spoken aloud at the very moment of her coronation, whether or not it actually was. Until the early 20th century, it was Georgian tradition for a copy of this poem to be included in every bride's dowry. Under Tamar, in other words, Georgia did not just win battles and stabilize succession. It produced a national epic that Georgians would still be reading, still be reciting, still be giving to their daughters on their wedding day, 900 years later. We know almost nothing certain about Rustaveli's life outside the poem itself, which is a strange kind of irony given how permanently he shaped the way Georgians think about their own history. Later legend, unverifiable but persistent, claims he fell hopelessly in love with the queen he served and, unable to bear watching her married to another man, retreated into a monastery in Jerusalem to live out his final years in obscurity, pouring the whole of that unspoken devotion into 6,600 verses about a knight whose entire purpose is loyalty to a love he can never quite possess. Whether that story is biography or myth grown up around a poet whose real life left no other trace, it captures something true about the emotional register of Tamar's court. Contemporary chroniclers described her not merely as capable or wise, but as extraordinarily beautiful, and treated that beauty as inseparable from her authority rather than in tension with it, weaving physical description and political legitimacy into the same breathless language. Icons commissioned during her reign were deliberately shaped to emphasize both her wisdom and her looks, a fusion of qualities Byzantine and Georgian art had almost never been asked to combine in a reigning monarch before. Because reigning monarchs, up to that point, had simply always been men. It is worth pausing here on just how deliberately literary this whole project was. Because Rustaveli did not simply write a flattering poem and hand it to his queen. He built an entire fictional cosmos, an India and an Arabia that existed nowhere on any real map, purely so that he could praise Tamar's court without the awkwardness of praising it directly. The way medieval poets across multiple cultures often used allegory to say things about living rulers that would have sounded absurd or dangerously excessive stated plainly. Rustaveli was not an isolated case. Either, Tamar's court became a magnet for scholars associated with a nearby monastic academy at Gelati, sometimes remembered as the New Athens, where Greek philosophy was studied not as a threat to Christian theology, but as a tool for understanding it more deeply. A genuinely daring intellectual position for the period. Historians, poets, and theologians converged around her reign in numbers Georgia had never seen concentrated in one place before. Monks and scholars traveling from monasteries as far away as Mount Athos and the Black Mountain near Antioch to study and teach within a kingdom that had, within a single generation, transformed itself from a battered frontier state into a genuine center of learning. The court chronicler, assigned to document her achievements, a figure historians usually refer to as Basil the Treasurer, wrote about her in language that occasionally tips over into outright religious reverence, describing her as something close to a fourth presence alongside the Holy Trinity itself, a line so bold it borders on blasphemy. And the fact that nobody in Tamar's court apparently stopped him from writing it tells you almost everything about how her contemporaries had come to see her by the height of her reign. Her patronage extended into stone as thoroughly as it did into poetry. New cathedrals rose across the kingdom under her sponsorship, and iconography of the period was deliberately reshaped to emphasize her wisdom and her beauty, part of a broader project, conscious or not, of visually reinforcing that a female monarch could embody the same majesty medieval art had always reserved for kings. Perhaps the most extraordinary of these projects was Vardsia, a monastery carved directly into the cliffside along the Kura River, a genuinely staggering feat of engineering that eventually stretched across roughly 500 meters of rock face, in tiers reaching up to 19 levels high, containing chapels, a reception hall, wine cellars sunk into the stone floor, and a chamber the local tradition still calls Tamar's room. It began under her father's reign, but reached its most significant development during hers, evolving from a modest monastic settlement into something closer to an entire hidden city hollowed directly out of a mountain, a retreat, a fortress, and eventually, though nobody assembling those cave chambers could have known it yet, a staging ground for one of the most consequential battles of her entire reign. Walk through what remains of Vardsia today, and you can still find the room the monastery's own custodians simply call Tamar's room, a chamber she is said to have used personally during her retreats there, and you can still see the remnants of roughly 25 wine cellars sunk directly into the tufa rock, once holding something like 185 wine jars in total, evidence of just how self-sufficient this carved settlement was designed to be, capable of sustaining an entire monastic and, when necessary, military population without depending on supply lines that an invading army could simply cut. The Church of the Dormition, at its heart, decorated with frescoes commissioned during Tamar's own reign, remains one of the few places on earth where you can look directly into the face of a contemporary portrait of her, painted by someone who had actually stood in a room with the living queen, rather than reconstructing her image centuries later from poetry and legend. Prayer, though, was never a small part of what drew her there. Behind the political calculation and the military strategy, contemporaries describe a monarch whose private devotion ran remarkably deep for someone carrying the weight of an expanding empire. She is said to have spent her days administering the affairs of state in full royal splendor, and her nights on her knees, praying for the strength of the Georgian Church and the safety of her kingdom, and to have occupied whatever quiet hours remained with needlework, distributing the results personally to the poor rather than treating charity as a delegated obligation handled by others on her behalf. Whether every detail of that image comes down to us intact, or has been softened and burnished by centuries of hagiography written after her death, the consistency of it across multiple independent sources suggests there was a genuine private intensity to her faith, one that would matter enormously in the crisis now bearing down on her kingdom from the southwest. A crisis that would send her walking barefoot across her own capital in an act of public devotion nobody watching could have mistaken for anything other than absolute sincerity. And it was to this carved mountain sanctuary, this monument to a golden age still very much in progress, that Tamar would soon retreat for something considerably more urgent than prayer or patronage of the arts. Because for all the poetry, all the churches, all the careful legal reform and calculated clemency, Georgia under Tamar was not a kingdom at peace with its neighbors, and the peace it had bought through years of internal consolidation was about to be tested from outside its borders in a way that would demand everything her father's gamble and her own political instincts had built. Georgian forces, under David Soslan's command, had already tasted major victory against a rival power in 1195 at a battle called Shamkori, crushing an army from the Eldiguzid state to the southeast, a Muslim power that had grown accustomed to treating the kingdoms along its northern border as tribute-paying inferiors rather than genuine rivals. The Georgian victory there was total enough that David's forces came away with the Abbasid Caliph's own battle standard among the captured spoils, a trophy with enormous symbolic weight across the entire Muslim world, since the Caliph in Baghdad still represented, at least nominally, the highest religious authority in Islam. Capturing his banner on a Caucasian battlefield was the kind of humiliation that traveled fast along trade routes and diplomatic channels alike, and it did exactly what David and Tamar needed it to do. It announced, unmistakably, that Georgia was no longer a kingdom that absorbed pressure from its neighbors. It was a kingdom that projected it, and it did so under the command of a queen most of those same neighbors had initially dismissed as a temporary weakness to be exploited, rather than a permanent power to be reckoned with. Georgian troops pushed into eastern Anatolia in the years that followed, seizing the strategically vital city of Erzurum around the turn of the century and, in the process, imposing taxes on the Muslim populations under their control, a direct disruption of the Seljuk sphere of influence that could not go unanswered forever. And it did not. Word reached the Seljuk Sultan of Rum, a man named Rukn ad-Din Suleiman Shah, that Georgian expansion had gone far enough. Suleiman had spent years painstakingly reassembling a fractured Seljuk state that his own father's death had splintered among rival brothers, and he had finally, through years of careful maneuvering, restored something resembling unified Seljuk authority across much of Anatolia. To this man, a woman ruling an expanding Christian kingdom on his northeastern frontier, taxing Muslim populations and absorbing formerly Seljuk-aligned territory into her sphere of control, was not merely a strategic problem. It was an insult to the entire order of the world as he understood it, a world where Muslim sultans held dominion and Christian queens, if they existed at all, did not command the loyalty of armies. He began rallying vassal emirs and atabegs from across the region into a coalition aimed squarely at stopping the Georgian queen once and for all, gathering, according to some accounts that likely exaggerate for dramatic effect, but nonetheless capture the scale of the threat, an army that Georgian chroniclers would later describe running into the hundreds of thousands. And then, in 1202, an emissary arrived at Tamar's court, carrying a letter from the Sultan himself. It did not read like ordinary diplomatic correspondence. According to the Georgian Chronicle, the letter opened by dismissing Tamar outright as a simpleton unfit to hold a throne, then moved to its actual demand: submit to Suleiman's authority, convert to Islam, and she would be permitted to become his wife. Refuse, and she would become his concubine instead, a captured spoil of war rather than a negotiating partner. It was, in a single letter, an attempt to strip away every dimension of Tamar's identity at once. Her sovereignty, her faith, her personhood, and reduce her to a possession awaiting collection. The Sultan clearly expected either fear or fury. What he was about to receive instead, delivered by the very men standing in the room when his messenger read those words aloud, was neither, and it was about to become one of the most quoted confrontations in the entire history of the Georgian court. A general named Zakaria Makagridzeli was standing close enough to hear every word of that letter translated aloud, and what happened to the Sultan's messenger in the seconds after the reading finished would set the entire tone for the war that followed. A war that would carry Tamar's armies, her husband's cavalry, and her kingdom's fate to a valley called Bassiani, 60 kilometers northeast of Erzurum, for a confrontation neither side was fully prepared to lose, and one that would decide, in a single brutal engagement, whether the Golden Age Georgia had spent nearly 2 decades building was about to become its own undoing. Zakaria Makagridzeli did not wait for permission. According to the Georgian Chronicle, when the interpreter finished reading Suleiman's demand aloud in front of the assembled court, Zakaria struck the messenger hard enough to knock him unconscious, leaving him, in the chronicler's own description, lying on the floor like a dead man. It is worth sitting with the audacity of that moment. Striking a sultan's official emissary was, under any normal diplomatic convention of the era, close to an act of war in itself, a violation grave enough to invite retaliation, regardless of what the letter had said. But nobody in that room seemed to believe there was anything normal left to preserve. Tamar herself, once the messenger had been revived and sent back across the frontier, is said to have delivered her own reply with far more restraint than her general, informing Suleiman simply that she had no interest in becoming his wife, his concubine, or his convert, and that if war was what his letter actually meant to propose, he would have it. Word of the confrontation would have traveled fast through a court and a kingdom that had spent nearly 2 decades watching this queen absorb insult after insult from men who assumed her gender made her an easy target, only to discover, again and again, that the assumption cost them more than it ever gained them. Suleiman had spent years painstakingly rebuilding a fractured Seljuk state, consolidating vassal emirs under his banner through a mixture of diplomacy and coercion. And it's worth remembering that a man who had worked that hard to project unified strength across his own fractious territory would have found nothing more threatening to that image than a woman ruler openly, publicly refusing his ultimatum. This was never only a war over disputed border towns and unpaid tribute. It was a contest over which vision of legitimate authority would define the region for the coming century, and both sides understood the stakes in exactly those terms. What followed was not simply a military mobilization. It was, by every surviving account, something closer to a religious one. Tamar summoned her forces to gather at Vardsia, the cave monastery her family had spent a generation carving into the cliffs above the Kura River, and it is here that one of the most vivid and most frequently retold images of her entire reign comes from. According to tradition preserved in the Georgian Chronicles, before the army marched south to meet Suleiman's coalition, Tamar walked barefoot from the church at Vardsia, praying before the icon of the Virgin that the monastery had been built to house, asking for the protection of her kingdom and her soldiers. Picture the scene the Chronicle is asking you to imagine. Thousands of soldiers assembled outside the cliffside monastery, horses and banners crowding the narrow approach, and somewhere above them, moving through the carved stone corridors barefoot despite her rank, a queen in her 40s by this point in her reign, walking the same passageways generations of monks had worn smooth, toward an icon believed to have already granted her family protection once before. Whether she genuinely covered that ground on bare feet across rock and cold mountain stone, or whether the detail is a devotional embellishment added by chroniclers eager to frame the coming battle as a holy undertaking blessed by personal sacrifice, is impossible to verify at this distance. But either way, the story tells you exactly how her contemporaries wanted this war remembered, not as territorial ambition, but as defense of the faith itself. Led by a monarch willing to suffer alongside the army she could not personally lead into combat. From Vardsia, the assembled Georgian forces marched toward a valley called Bassiani, roughly 60 kilometers northeast of the city of Erzurum, in territory that today sits inside northeastern Turkey. The exact year is one more detail historians still debate. Some place the battle in 1202. Others push it as late as 1204 or slightly after, since surviving Georgian, Armenian and Islamic sources don't fully agree with each other on the calendar. But the shape of what happened there is consistent enough across every account that we can trust it in outline, even if the precise date stays fuzzy. Suleiman had assembled an enormous coalition, drawing in emirs and atabegs from across the region who answered his call either out of loyalty or out of fear of what a unified Seljuk Sultan might do to those who refused him. Georgian chronicles, prone to exaggeration in the way essentially every medieval chronicle was prone to exaggeration when describing an enemy's numbers, describe his army as staggeringly vast, and while we should treat any specific figure from this period with real skepticism, the consistent impression across the sources is that Suleiman's coalition significantly outnumbered the Georgian force gathering to meet it. David Soslan took command of the Georgian center, a body of tens of thousands of soldiers drawn from Kartli and the Javakheti region, while the western contingents, Abkhazians and Svans from the mountainous regions along the Black Sea coast, anchored one flank, and eastern troops from Kakheti and Hereti anchored the other. Zakaria Makagridzeli, the same commander who had struck down the Sultan's messenger, led the vanguard, the forward strike force, whose job was to make first contact with the enemy. The battle itself, by every account, was brutal and close fought, nothing like the clean, decisive rout that later Georgian retellings sometimes made it sound like. The Georgians opened with a night assault, using their advance guard to strike Suleiman's camp under cover of darkness and sow confusion before the main Seljuk force could organize a coherent response. It nearly worked perfectly, and then it nearly didn't work at all. Suleiman, to his credit as a commander, managed to rally his shaken troops and mount a genuine counterattack, one forceful enough that even the Georgian Chronicle, a document with every institutional incentive to make Tamar's forces look invincible, concedes that the Georgian line came close to buckling at one critical point in the fighting. Georgian cavalrymen were forced to dismount in places and fight hand-to-hand on foot, a sign of how chaotic and desperate the engagement had become. Imagine the scale of it for a moment. Tens of thousands of men on each side, crowded into a mountain valley in the cold months of the year, banners torn and trampled underfoot, horses screaming amid the press of bodies. The entire fate of two competing visions of regional power being decided not through some elegant tactical masterstroke, but through hours of exhausting, confusing, close-quarters violence, where neither commander could see more than a fraction of his own army at any given moment. But the coordinated flanking maneuvers David Soslan and Zakaria had planned held together under pressure, closing around the Seljuk center from both sides at once, and eventually shattering their formation entirely. Suleiman's own banner was captured in the collapse, and the loss of that banner, the physical symbol of the Sultan's presence and authority on the battlefield, triggered a cascading panic through the rest of his coalition, the way it so often did in medieval warfare, where an army's cohesion depended enormously on visible proof that its commander was still standing and still in control. Suleiman himself was wounded in the fighting and fled the field, retreating back toward the safety of Erzurum's walls, leaving behind an army in full collapse. The scale of the Georgian victory becomes clearest in what happened in its immediate aftermath. Suleiman's own brother was among those captured on the field. So was the emir of Erzincan, a man named Faratin Beramar, one of the Sultan's closest allies in the coalition, brought before Tamar along with the other captured commanders and war banners. And here, once again, you see the exact pattern that had defined her reign since the earliest days of the Kutlu Arslan rebellion. Overwhelming force followed by calculated mercy, at least at first. Tamar reportedly received the captured nobles graciously, offering words of comfort rather than humiliation, and honored each one according to his rank, distributing most of them among various Georgian fortresses to be held rather than executed. The emir of Erzincan, in particular, was kept in Tbilisi under conditions closer to hospitality than imprisonment, a courtesy the Chronicle attributes to a friendship that had existed between him and the Georgian court before the war. But mercy, in Tamar's political vocabulary, was never unconditional, and it was never permanent if circumstances changed. According to the Georgian Chronicle, this same noble and once honored guest was, in time, sold into slavery for the price of a single iron horseshoe. An act of calculated humiliation, so specific and so pointed that it reads almost like a public message, rather than a punishment. A reminder that Georgian hospitality toward a defeated enemy could be withdrawn precisely as deliberately as it had been extended. It is worth pausing here on just how unusual her diplomatic touch actually was for the period. Because Tamar never treated defeated rivals as a monolithic category to be handled identically. Some, like the rebellious lords who had briefly crowned Yuri, received calculated mercy meant to buy loyalty. Others, like the emir of Erzincan, received warm hospitality that could be withdrawn just as deliberately once circumstances changed. Still others, the ones who tested that mercy a second time, met consequences swift enough to discourage anyone else from making the same miscalculation. That range of response, applied with what appears from the surviving record to have been real precision rather than improvisation, is arguably as important to understanding how she held together an empire this large for this long, as any single battlefield victory was. Contemporaries beyond Georgia's own borders noticed this quality too, describing her diplomacy and her sense of justice in terms that went well past the usual flattery reserved for powerful monarchs, language that, taken alongside the military record, paints a portrait of a ruler who understood something many conquerors of her era never quite grasped: that holding territory taken by force required a completely different set of skills than taking it in the first place, and that the two skills rarely showed up together in the same person by accident. The victory at Bassiani did more than repel a single invasion. It fundamentally reshaped the balance of power across the entire eastern edge of Anatolia. Building on the momentum of the win, Tamar's forces pushed further, annexing the city of Divin and the surrounding region of Iran in the years that immediately followed, while subduing the emirate of Kars and extending Georgian authority over the Shah Armans and the emirs of Erzurum and Erzincan themselves, converting what had recently been a hostile coalition into a network of subordinate territories paying tribute to Tbilisi. Georgian expeditions pressed even deeper into what is now Azerbaijan and northern Iran in the years that followed, with expeditions reportedly reaching as far as Ardabil and Tabriz, and later still into Kazvin and Koy, names on a map that, strung together, trace a Georgian sphere of influence stretching from the Black Sea coast almost to the edge of the Iranian plateau. A reach that would have sounded like fantasy to anyone standing in that same council chamber in Tbilisi back in 1178. Watching a teenage girl being crowned beside a father whose own kingdom, for all its recent recovery under David the Builder's reforms, was still very much a regional power rather than the dominant force it was about to become. To put that in perspective, a Georgian expedition raiding near Tabriz meant Georgian cavalry had ridden roughly 600 kilometers from Tbilisi, deep into territory that, a generation earlier, no Georgian monarch would have dreamed of contesting, let alone reaching. Georgia, under a monarch a Seljuk sultan had once dismissed outright as a simpleton unfit to hold a throne, had become the single most dominant power across the entire Caucasus and much of eastern Anatolia. There was, in other words, a very direct irony sitting inside Suleiman's own insulting letter. The woman he had tried to reduce to either a wife or a concubine had just spent the years following his defeat systematically absorbing the territory of nearly every neighbor who might once have questioned whether a woman could hold what she already held. News of the defeat rippled outward through the wider Muslim world in ways that went well beyond the immediate territorial losses. A sultan who had spent years carefully rebuilding a fractured Seljuk state, consolidating vassal loyalty through a mixture of marriage alliances and outright coercion, had just suffered a public, humiliating defeat at the hands of a Christian queen he'd openly mocked as unfit to rule. And defeats of that particular flavor, ones that also carried a pointed challenge to assumptions about gender and legitimate authority, tended to travel further and linger longer in regional memory than an ordinary battlefield loss between two rival Muslim states might have. Smaller emirates throughout the region, watching how thoroughly Suleiman's coalition had been shattered, appear to have concluded that resisting Georgian expansion directly was no longer a realistic option, which helps explain how quickly and how relatively bloodlessly Tamar's forces were able to absorb Kars, Erzurum, and the surrounding territories in the years immediately following Bassiani. Diplomacy, backed by the unmistakable threat of a repeat performance, accomplished nearly as much in this period as further warfare did. And then, less than a year after Constantinople itself fell into chaos, an entirely different kind of opportunity arrived at Tamar's court, one that had nothing to do with battlefield victory and everything to do with family. In 1204, the armies of the Fourth Crusade, a campaign that had originally set out for the Holy Land and instead turned its violence against fellow Christians, sacked Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, an event so seismic that it shattered the empire into competing fragments that would spend the next half-century fighting over which piece represented its legitimate continuation. Among the casualties of that collapse, at least politically, were two young men named Alexios and David Komnenos, grandsons of a deposed and murdered Byzantine emperor named Andronicus I Komnenos, whose own downfall decades earlier had left his descendants scattered and vulnerable. Sources disagree, sometimes sharply, on exactly how these two young men ended up connected to the Georgian court and precisely how they were related to Tamar. Some scholars argue their mother was Tamar's own sister. Others trace a more distant connection through marriage, and the ambiguity itself tells you how murky the surviving genealogical record actually is for this branch of the fallen Byzantine dynasty. It's the kind of gap that's easy to gloss over in a quick retelling, but genuinely matters for how we understand Tamar's motives here. If the brothers really were her nephews by blood, sheltering and then arming them looks like a mixture of family obligation and shrewd strategic opportunity arriving together. If the relationship was more distant or largely political, the same actions look almost entirely like calculated statecraft, using a plausible dynastic claim as convenient cover for what was, underneath it, a straightforward bid to extend Georgian influence onto the Black Sea coast. What the sources agree on is the outcome. Tamar took the two brothers in, provided them refuge and, by most reconstructions, an education at her own court, and referred to as her own nephews by at least one Trapezuntine chronicler writing decades later. In the spring of 1204, while the Fourth Crusade's soldiers were still finishing their occupation of Constantinople and word of the sack had not yet even fully reached the Black Sea coast, Alexios and David marched west out of Georgia with troops Tamar had provided them, and seized the city of Trebizond, a wealthy and strategically vital Byzantine port on the southern shore of the Black Sea. Some historians who have studied the timing closely point out that the brothers appear to have begun their march before news of Constantinople's fall could plausibly have reached them, which suggests their original goal may not have been to exploit the empire's collapse at all, but something else perhaps, as some scholars have proposed, to carve out a buffer state that would shield Georgia's own western flank from Seljuk pressure, using two exiled Byzantine princes with a legitimate claim as the political justification. Whatever the original intention, the timing worked out extraordinarily well for everyone involved. Alexios declared himself emperor in his newly captured capital at the age of 22, founding what history now calls the Empire of Trebizond, one of three rival successor states, alongside the Empire of Nicaea and the Despotate of Epirus, that emerged from the wreckage of Byzantium to each claim they alone represented the legitimate continuation of Roman imperial authority. His brother David, meanwhile, pushed further west along the coast with a mixed force of Georgian troops and local mercenaries, extending the new empire's reach into Paphlagonia and toward the old Byzantine territories along the Black Sea, a campaign aggressive enough that it briefly put Georgian-backed forces within striking distance of the outskirts of what remained of the old imperial heartland itself. That aggression did not go unanswered forever. The rival empire of Nicaea, itself claiming to be the legitimate Byzantine successor state and watching David's advance with understandable alarm, eventually pushed back hard enough to check his westward momentum within a few years. A reminder that even a family this favored by circumstance could not simply expand indefinitely once the initial chaos of the Fourth Crusade's aftermath began to settle into something resembling a stable, contested balance of power among the various claimants. Trebizond would go on to outlast both of its rivals combined, surviving as an independent Greek state for more than 2.5 centuries, becoming, eventually, the very last fragment of the Roman Empire to fall when the Ottomans finally conquered it in 1461, nearly a decade after Constantinople itself had already fallen to them. For at least its first several years, historians generally agree Trebizond functioned as something close to a Georgian client state, a buffer kingdom whose survival depended directly on the troops and support Tamar had provided to establish it in the first place, which meant that, by 1204, Georgian influence stretched not just across the Caucasus and deep into Anatolia, but now along a meaningful stretch of the Black Sea coast as well, projected through a royal house that owed its very existence to her. It is a genuinely remarkable thing to sit with. Within the span of about 2 years, the same monarch who had just crushed an invasion aimed at reducing her to a captured bride had also become, indirectly, the architect of an entirely new empire on foreign soil, one that would go on to outlive her own Georgian kingdom's golden age by more than 200 years. It is genuinely difficult to overstate what this meant for Georgia's position in the wider Christian world. With Constantinople itself now occupied by Latin Crusaders and the traditional center of Orthodox Christian authority effectively dismantled, Tamar suddenly found herself presiding over the single most powerful, independent Orthodox Christian state left standing anywhere in the region. Byzantine refugees, scholars, and clergy, fleeing the chaos of the Latin occupation, increasingly looked toward Tbilisi and toward Trebizond, the client state Georgia had just helped install, as places where Orthodox Christian civilization could continue functioning largely undisturbed by the Crusader violence reshaping the old imperial core. Cronegarists at her court, perhaps not entirely without justification given the circumstances, began referring to Tbilisi itself as a kind of New Rome, and to Tamar as Augusta, the same title Roman and Byzantine tradition had reserved for its empresses. This was not a modest claim. It placed Georgia, at least rhetorically, in direct succession to an imperial legacy that had defined Christian civilization for the better part of a millennium. And it is a measure of how genuinely dominant Georgia had become under her rule that the claim did not sound entirely absurd to the people making it. A queen who, less than 3 decades earlier, had needed her aunt and a bishop to talk a room full of hostile nobles into accepting her legitimacy at all, was now being compared, without apparent irony, to the emperors of Rome itself. None of this expansion came at the expense of the cultural project she had already spent nearly 2 decades building. If anything, the flood of tribute, trade revenue, and captured spoils pouring into the treasury after Bassiani and the Trebizond expedition accelerated it. Ecclesiastical art flourished further. Illuminated manuscripts, painstakingly copied and decorated by hand in monastic scriptoria across the kingdom, multiplied in number and grew more elaborate in their execution. Their pages sometimes bordered in gold leaf and populated with the same kind of idealized royal portraiture that Varzia's frescoes had already established as a visual language for depicting Tamar's own likeness. Metalwork and mosaic art reached a level of sophistication that later scholars, looking back across the centuries, would coin the phrase Georgian Renaissance to describe, a term meant to signal that what happened culturally under Tamar's patronage wasn't simply continued growth from her predecessor's foundations, but something closer to a genuine qualitative leap, comparable in ambition, if not in scale, to the intellectual flowering that would later reshape Western Europe centuries afterward. New churches and monastic complexes continued rising across the kingdom throughout these years, funded by a treasury that had never been fuller, each one another physical, permanent record of a reign its own participants seemed to sense, even while living through it, was unlikely to be repeated. Coins minted during these years carried her image and her expanding list of titles out along every trade route her merchants traveled, a form of propaganda as effective in its own century as any chronicle or painted icon, since a coin passed through more hands and traveled further than almost anything else a medieval monarch could produce. Behind all of this, the conquest, the diplomacy, the flourishing court culture ran a current of personal religious devotion that seems, from everything the sources describe, to have only deepened as her power grew rather than being crowded out by it. Georgian hagiographic writing composed after her death consistently returns to this same image, a monarch who ruled by day with the full ceremonial weight of a medieval court, and who prayed by night with an intensity that her attendants apparently found remarkable enough to record. One story preserved in later hagiographic accounts of her life, and worth treating as devotional legend rather than verified biography, describes Tamar preparing one morning to attend a liturgy at Gelati, having fastened a belt studded with precious rubies around her waist as part of her royal dress for the occasion. Word reached her that a beggar was waiting outside the monastery gate, asking for alms, and she reportedly asked her attendants to have him wait while she finished dressing. By the time she went out to give him something, the story goes, the beggar had vanished. Devastated by what she took as a rebuke for having kept Christ himself, appearing to her, in the logic of the story, in the disguise of the poor man, waiting even briefly. She is said to have removed the jeweled belt on the spot and donated it to the church as an offering, treating the ornament that had briefly delayed her charity as the very thing responsible for the delay. Whether this incident happened precisely as later Georgian hagiography describes it, or whether it is one of the many devotional stories that accumulate around any monarch the church eventually decides to canonize, it captures something the sources agree on more broadly: a queen whose days were spent administering an empire in full royal splendor, and whose nights, by multiple independent accounts, were spent on her knees, praying for the strength of the Georgian Church, occupying whatever hours remained with needlework she distributed personally to the poor, rather than treating charity as someone else's job. It is worth noting how unusual this reputation is set against the wider portrait we've built across both parts of her story. A monarch capable of ordering a defeated ally sold for the price of a horseshoe was, by the same body of evidence, also a monarch who reportedly could not forgive herself for making a single beggar wait a few extra minutes at a monastery gate. Historians who study her reign tend not to treat these as contradictory portraits requiring reconciliation so much as two genuinely coexisting dimensions of the same person. The same way any consequential leader in any century tends to hold within them a capacity for both ruthlessness and tenderness that rarely gets remembered in equal proportion. David Soslan did not live to see how far his wife's kingdom would ultimately reach. He died in 1207, roughly 2 decades into a marriage that had provided Tamar with the political stability, the military leadership, and the 2 heirs that her first marriage had failed to deliver on every count. The sources give us frustratingly little detail about the circumstances of his death, or Tamar's private reaction to it, which is itself a kind of telling silence. A monarch whose every public act tended to generate extensive chronicling suddenly recedes from the record during what must have been one of the most personally significant losses of her adult life. It is tempting, and I think reasonably fair, to read something into that silence. Perhaps grief this personal simply fell outside what a medieval court chronicle, focused overwhelmingly on statecraft and military achievement, considered worth recording in detail, regardless of how it might have actually felt to the woman living through it. What we can infer, based on how the kingdom continued to function seamlessly in the years immediately following his death, is that the institutional stability David had helped build proved durable enough to survive his absence. A testament to how thoroughly Tamar's own authority, never dependent on his in the first place, had become the actual load-bearing structure of the Georgian state all along. In the years after David's death, Tamar took the step that her own father had taken with her decades earlier, moving to secure the succession while she still had the strength to shape it personally. Her son George, sometimes remembered by the byname Lasha, was raised to the position of co-ruler, sharing the throne alongside his mother in the same arrangement George III had once used to prepare Tamar herself for sole rule, and some sources place the beginning of this co-rule as early as 1207, the same year his father died, suggesting Tamar may have moved to formalize her son's position almost immediately after losing her husband, whether out of practical urgency or personal instinct toward continuity. It is hard not to notice the symmetry, whether or not Tamar herself consciously intended it as an echo of her own childhood. The exact mechanism her father had once used to smuggle an unprecedented female heir into legitimacy was now being used, in reverse, to smooth a conventional male succession that faced none of the resistance her own accession once had. George would go on to inherit sole rule of a kingdom at the absolute height of its territorial and cultural power, though the reign that followed his mother's would prove, in time, far less capable of holding that height than his mother's had been at building it. Tamar's own health began to fail sometime in the final years of her reign, though the precise chronology, like so much else about her life, is contested among historians who have tried to reconstruct it from fragmentary and sometimes contradictory sources. The traditional and still most widely accepted account places her death in January of 1213, though a meaningful minority of scholars, working from internal inconsistencies in the charter evidence and the chronicle's own timeline, have argued she may actually have died earlier, possibly as early as 1207 or 1210, with the more famous 1213 date reflecting either a later commemorative tradition or simple confusion in sources compiled after the fact. It's a strange thing to realize, sitting with this uncertainty, that we can reconstruct the precise sequence of a Seljuk sultan's insulting letter and the exact banners captured on a specific battlefield with more confidence than we can reconstruct the year the most celebrated monarch in Georgian history actually died. But that is often how medieval record-keeping worked. Institutions tracked triumphs and treaties with far more diligence than they tracked the private, often chaotic circumstances of a ruler's final illness. According to the fullest surviving account, the Queen was discussing affairs of state with her ministers at a castle called Nachamajevi, near the town of Gori, not far from her own capital, when she was suddenly overtaken by illness. There is something almost unbearably ordinary about that detail, if you let yourself sit with it. Not a dramatic collapse on a battlefield, not a death scene staged for maximum symbolic weight, the way court chroniclers so often preferred to record the passing of great monarchs, but a woman doing the unglamorous, exhausting work of actual governance, mid-conversation about some administrative matter now lost entirely to history, when her body simply gave out. Her own chronicler attributed the sickness to the accumulated physical toll of years spent following her armies across brutal campaign seasons in the mountains and frontier regions of the Caucasus. Though we should treat that explanation as the interpretation of a court historian working within the medical understanding of his own era, rather than anything resembling a clinical diagnosis we could verify today. She was moved first to Tbilisi and then to a nearby castle called Agarani, where, according to the chronicle, she died, mourned by subjects across a kingdom that had known no other ruler for most of living memory among its younger generations. Think about what that actually means demographically. By 1213, Georgia contained an entire generation of adults, potentially even approaching middle age, who had been born after Tamar's coronation and had therefore never once experienced life under any other monarch. For those people, her death wasn't simply the loss of a ruler. It was the end of the only version of Georgia they had personally ever known. Chroniclers writing in the aftermath described a genuine outpouring of public grief, the kind that goes beyond the ceremonial mourning any medieval court was obligated to perform for a departed monarch. And while we should read that description with the same caution we apply to any other flattering detail in a chronicle written to honor its subject, the sheer scale and duration of Tamar's posthumous reputation across the following centuries suggests the grief described wasn't purely manufactured for the occasion. What happened to her body afterward is where the historical record essentially dissolves into legend, and where I think it's worth being especially careful about separating what we can actually document from what centuries of devotional storytelling have layered on top of it. The most straightforward account holds that her remains were first brought to the cathedral at Mosqueta, the traditional spiritual heart of Georgian Christianity, and from there transferred to Gelati Monastery, the same complex her great-grandfather David the Builder had founded. which had functioned for generations as the customary burial ground for Georgia's royal Bagrationi dynasty. If that account is accurate, Tamar should be resting today in the same royal necropolis as the ancestors whose kingdom she had expanded beyond anything they could have imagined. But the trail, as far as anyone has ever been able to verify, goes cold almost immediately after that transfer. Archaeological searches at Galati, beginning with a serious excavation effort led by the Georgian scholar Ektim Takeshvili, starting around 1920 and continuing intermittently across the following century, have failed to locate any grave that can be confidently identified as hers, despite Galati's clear historical role as the resting place for other Georgian monarchs whose tombs have, in some cases, been successfully identified. David the Builder's own grave, for instance, sits at the monastery's south gate to this day, deliberately positioned, according to tradition, so that everyone entering would walk directly over it, a gesture of humility so pointed that modern visitors now go out of their way to avoid stepping on it, inverting the very point the founder had apparently intended to make about his own place before God, that his tomb survives so clearly identified while his great-granddaughter's does not, despite her being, by nearly every measure available to us, the more consequential monarch of the two, is one more small, strange irony sitting inside this whole mystery, and one that later generations of Georgian archaeologists and historians have never entirely stopped trying to resolve, even without much realistic hope at this point of ever actually succeeding. Into that gap, legend has rushed in with considerable enthusiasm. One persistent story, impossible to verify but too evocative to leave out of any honest telling of this, holds that Tamar's own guards or closest attendants, fearing that her grave might eventually be desecrated by enemies of the kingdom she'd spent her life expanding, deliberately concealed her burial site, and then, to protect the secret permanently, killed each other one by one until the last among them took his own life, ensuring that no living person could ever be forced or bribed into revealing the location. It is the kind of story that tells you more about how Georgians processed the loss of their greatest monarch than it tells you about anything that plausibly happened in a real castle in the year of her death. And it's worth treating it exactly that way, as folklore shaped by grief and pride, rather than as history. Another version of the story, tied specifically to Gelati, claims that when archaeologists finally located what they believed to be her tomb in the early 20th century, they discovered an inscribed warning cursing anyone who dared disturb it, and that the workers, shaken by what they'd uncovered, refused to continue the excavation, leaving the grave undisturbed and its exact location never officially confirmed since. That particular account comes down to us through popular retellings rather than peer-reviewed archaeological reports, so it's best understood as part of the same oral tradition that produced the guards' mutual suicide story, rather than as a documented finding. A separate and entirely different tradition holds that her remains never stayed in Georgia at all, and instead were quietly transported to Jerusalem for burial in the Holy Land she had supported through pilgrimage and diplomacy throughout her reign. A claim that gained unexpected, if still inconclusive, support from a 13th century letter written by a French knight named Guillaume de Bois, who described encountering Tamar's own son in the Holy Land, apparently in the process of transporting his mother's remains for burial somewhere near Jerusalem. A Greek archaeologist working decades later even claimed to have excavated a grave in Jerusalem he believed was hers, though that identification, too, remains far from settled among historians who have examined the evidence. And it's entirely possible we are looking at multiple independent legends that grew up around the same underlying historical mystery, rather than corroborating pieces of a single true account. None of these accounts can be definitively confirmed or ruled out with the evidence currently available, and it's worth being honest about that rather than picking whichever version makes for the better story. What we can say with real confidence is only this: Tamar the Great, the most powerful monarch Georgia ever produced, who expanded her kingdom farther than any ruler before or since, whose armies humiliated a sultan, and whose diplomacy helped found an empire that would outlast Byzantium itself, has no confirmed grave anywhere on earth. As one Georgian writer put it in the early 20th century, reflecting on the centuries of failed searches, she belongs to everyone and to no one, and her grave exists less as a physical location than as an idea living permanently in the imagination of an entire nation. That unresolved absence only seems to have deepened her legend rather than diminishing it. Folk tradition in the Caucasus Mountains eventually produced a version of Tamar that departs entirely from anything a historian would recognize, transforming her into something closer to a sleeping guardian spirit, said to rest in a hidden cave somewhere deep in the mountain ranges she once ruled, waiting for the moment Georgia needs her most, when she will supposedly wake and emerge to usher in a second golden age. It's a striking transformation to trace if you sit with it for a moment, a documented medieval monarch whose actual reign we can reconstruct from charters, chronicles, coins, and contemporary poetry with real specificity, gradually accumulating a second, parallel existence in folklore that has almost nothing to do with recorded history and everything to do with what Georgians, across the centuries of foreign occupation and hardship that followed her death, needed her to represent. It is worth noticing, too, how closely this sleeping monarch legend echoes similar folk traditions attached to other rulers across medieval Europe and the Near East. Figures like Frederick Barbarossa in German legend, said to slumber beneath a mountain awaiting his own kingdom's hour of need. Evidence that this particular way of processing the loss of a beloved ruler, refusing to accept the finality of death and instead relocating the monarch into a permanent, dormant readiness, was something multiple cultures independently reached for when a reign felt too significant to simply end. Other legends from her own lifetime, preserved by chroniclers who clearly saw nothing contradictory about praising a rational, capable administrator in the same breath as attributing supernatural qualities to her, claimed that her son had been conceived when a beam of sunlight passed through a palace window, casting her, consciously or not, in the mold of older pre-Christian Caucasian deities associated with fertility and control over the weather, a blending of Christian queenship with much older regional religious imagery that tells you something about how thoroughly her reign had already begun merging history and myth even while she was still alive to read the poetry being written about her. This kind of layering, a devout Christian monarch nonetheless draped in the residual imagery of older pre-Christian regional belief, is not unique to Tamar by any means, but it is unusually well documented in her case. Likely because so much of her contemporary court poetry and iconography survives intact for historians to study directly, rather than only through much later retellings. The Georgian Orthodox Church formally recognized what popular devotion had apparently already decided for itself, canonizing Tamar as a saint sometime after her death. An honor rare enough for any medieval monarch, and rarer still for a woman in a tradition that had, prior to Tamar, recognized almost no female saints among its ruling class, going back nearly a millennium. She is remembered in the church calendar today on two separate occasions. The 14th of May, marking the anniversary of her death according to one tradition, and again during the second week following Easter, a second commemoration tied more to her piety and her role as a protector of the faith than to the specific date of her passing. Georgians still refer to this second commemoration by the name Tamaroba, a feast day that has continued, largely uninterrupted across 8 centuries of dynastic collapse, foreign conquest, and Soviet religious suppression, right up to the present moment. That continuity alone is worth pausing on. A religious observance tied to a woman who ruled 800 years ago survived not just the Mongol invasions that broke her kingdom apart within a generation of her death, but also Ottoman and Persian domination in later centuries, absorption into the Russian Empire, 7 decades of Soviet state atheism that actively worked to suppress religious practice across the entire region, and finally, the chaotic transition to Georgian independence in the 1990s. Very little from the 12th century survives that kind of gauntlet intact. Her feast day did, observed in Georgian churches this year exactly as it has been observed for the better part of a millennium. A continuity that outlasted the empire that first established it. The invasions that broke that empire apart, and every regime that came after determined, at various points, to erase the religious traditions built up around it. What she could not protect her kingdom from, in the end, was time. Or more specifically, the catastrophe that arrived from the east less than 2 decades after her death. The Mongol armies that would eventually reshape the map of nearly the entire Eurasian landmass first appeared in the Caucasus during the 1220s, while her son, George Lasha, still sat on the throne she had left him, and the devastation that followed hit Georgia with a force the kingdom's institutions, built and refined across generations to withstand rebellious nobles and Seljuk sultans, had never been designed to absorb. This was not a threat that responded to the tools Tamar had spent her reign perfecting: the careful balance of church and aristocracy, the calculated mixture of overwhelming force and strategic clemency, the alliances built patiently with neighboring rulers over years of diplomacy. The Mongols arrived with a scale and a tactical sophistication that simply did not exist anywhere else in the medieval world at that time, and no amount of accumulated Georgian Golden Age wealth or military reputation could have changed that basic mismatch. George himself was severely wounded fighting the Mongols and died from those injuries in 1222, passing the throne to his sister Rushadan, Tamar's daughter, who would spend her own reign watching the golden age her mother had built come apart piece by piece under pressure no amount of Georgian resilience could fully withstand. Rushadan, ruling from 1223 to 1245, found herself forced into an increasingly desperate set of compromises just to keep any version of Georgian sovereignty intact, eventually accepting Mongol overlordship rather than risk total destruction. A far cry from the kingdom that had once dictated terms to a Seljuk sultan from a position of total military superiority. It is worth being fair to Rushadan here, rather than simply using her reign as a contrast to make her mother look better by comparison, because the crisis she inherited was not a failure of her own governance, so much as a genuinely unprecedented external shock. The Mongol confederation that swept into the Caucasus in the 1220s was not another regional rival like the Seljuks or the various emirates Tamar had spent her reign absorbing and outmaneuvering. It was an entirely new category of threat, unlike anything the diplomatic and military playbook Tamar had perfected across nearly 30 years on the throne had ever been designed to counter. And kingdoms with far deeper resources and far longer military traditions than Georgia's fared no better against it in these same decades. She reigned, in other words, as the second woman in Georgian history to hold supreme power in her own right, following directly in the precedent her mother had shattered open decades earlier. Proof, if any more were needed, that Tamar's reign had genuinely changed what Georgians considered possible for a female monarch. even if Rusudan inherited a kingdom whose fortunes had already turned in ways her mother's political instincts, formidable as they were, likely could not have reversed either. It is a somewhat bleak footnote to an otherwise triumphant story, but an honest one. The same reign that proved a woman could build an empire also, within a single generation, proved that even the most carefully constructed empire could not outlast the specific set of circumstances that had allowed it to flourish in the first place. Within roughly a generation of Tamar's death, the kingdom that had once stretched from the Black Sea nearly to the Caspian, that had humiliated a Seljuk sultan and helped found an empire on the Anatolian coast, had been permanently and irreversibly diminished. Nothing that came after in Georgian history, and plenty did come after, including moments of genuine revival, most notably centuries later under a king remembered as George the Brilliant, ever fully recaptured the specific, singular combination of territorial reach, cultural output, and internal stability that had defined her reign at its height, which is, in its own way, exactly why she has never really left. I think about this a lot when I'm putting these scripts together, how some historical figures fade the moment their kingdom does, and others somehow grow larger in the exact proportion that everything they built collapses around their memory. Tamar's face appears today on Georgian currency, on the 50 lari note, printed alongside imagery drawn from the same medieval world she once ruled. She turned up, entirely unexpectedly, as a playable leader in a modern strategy video game about building civilizations, introduced to a generation of players who have likely never read a single line of Rustaveli, but now know, at minimum, that Georgia once had a queen powerful enough to be worth including among history's great rulers. Streets, churches, cathedrals, and, by some counts, more Georgian women than any other historical figure share her name today. Walk through Tbilisi, and you'll find her memory embedded in the everyday texture of the city in ways that go well past formal monuments, in the names parents still choose for their daughters, in the wine served at family gatherings from vineyards whose cultivation traces back, in local tradition if not always in verifiable record, to techniques refined during her golden age, in the casual, almost unconscious way Georgians will reference her reign as the measuring stick against which every later period of national success or hardship gets compared. There's something worth sitting with in just how unusual that kind of endurance actually is. Most medieval monarchs, even genuinely accomplished ones, become footnotes eventually, names in textbooks recognized mainly by specialists rather than living presences in a nation's everyday sense of itself. Tamar didn't become a footnote. If anything, the very absence of a confirmed grave seems to have prevented her from ever fully settling into the past tense at all, leaving her permanently suspended in that strange, powerful space between historical record and living myth, exactly where a Georgian writer once suggested she belonged. 9 centuries after a father who had just ordered his own nephew mutilated looked at a room full of armed noblemen and decided, for reasons we will never fully recover, that his daughter deserved a word no woman in his kingdom had ever been allowed to hold. That decision is still being argued over, still being romanticized, still being quietly disputed by historians chasing down inconsistent dates and unverifiable quotations, which is, I'd argue, exactly the kind of afterlife a monarch this genuinely consequential deserves. Whatever that word actually cost her, the marriage she didn't choose, the years spent proving a legitimacy no man in her position would ever have needed to prove, the grave that still, after 8 centuries of searching, no one has ever definitively found, she kept it, and she kept it on her own terms, right up until the very end of a reign no council of nobles, no rival sultan, and no exiled prince ever managed to take away from her. Every fracture that came before her reign, and every collapse that came rushing in after it, only seems to throw into sharper relief how completely, for those years in between, she made an entire kingdom answer to a woman it had never expected to obey. And then, having done that, made it forget it had ever thought that obedience was unusual at all. 900 years on, that is still the story Georgia tells about itself. Whether the version reaching you comes from a careful academic reconstruction of charters and battle chronicles, or from a grandmother somewhere in the mountains describing a queen still sleeping under the rock, waiting for the day her country calls her name again.